Ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor to introduce to you Mr. Bob Hoban.
Tracy, thank you very much for the warm introduction, and it's my pleasure to be here today. Looking forward to the rest of the program, and looking forward to talking about one of my favorite topics, that of course is the hemp plant.
Thank you, Bob. Floor is yours, sir.
Well, as I think about things over the last couple of years and how this industry has evolved, I used to make a suggestion that do we really have a hemp industry or do we have a CBD industry? And I would think that over time, the focus on CBD has gone so far to one extreme that it's kind of bounced back into the middle. And I would suggest very clearly to everyone today that we don't even have CBD as an industry. It's been relegated, properly so, to an ingredient. And it is an ingredient. And as such, to Kim's points a few moments ago, is it the biotech, the bio side, or is it the CPG side? These are critical components, but we've seen those things get put into their lanes as either medicine or wellness or food products. But also what we're seeing is this resurgence, this explosive growth in what I would call the full plant use. And we'll get into that in a little bit. What I want to talk about today really has two different sides. What has COVID done to impact the industry? And what's the outlook in that regard? And then what do we see, generally speaking, for the remainder of 2020, which has been a difficult year thus far for so many people, for so many reasons, but there is still a lot of positive things to look at as it relates to this plant and this industry. So what I'll talk about is sort of against the backdrop of regulations and the market numbers, looking at the economics, looking at the data to help drive those decisions. It's more context than anything else. So let's start with the COVID point. It does not necessarily seem to resonate with so many people, but deals that have been in existence prior to the COVID did in fact go through, and in our experience, most of those deals had closed. A large number of those deals had gotten restructured, perhaps because of the uncertainties associated with the pandemic, and there still are a number of those very same uncertainties. But at the end of the day, we did see many of those deals from an M&A perspective go forward. We also saw that the industry itself has been robust in that reporting from a number of our clients in the US and around the globe, that activity was up in some months and stable in other months. So it seems to be a good situation to operate in because of the public health nature of it for folks engaged in the CBD industry that have already had good, reliable distribution. But what we've seen is more of a focus on new deals coming to the table, sort of evolving to the higher level uses of the plant. Things that aren't as quote unquote sexy as cannabinoids. We're looking at more ag-based or infrastructure-based plays. The days of investing in extraction labs in the United States, I wouldn't say they're over, but there's been a huge build out of the extraction infrastructure, borrowing a lot of natural products, herbal products, and marijuana-related technologies. That infrastructure build out came to a screeching halt last year when so much of the oversaturation of the plant biomass really created a place with the lack of FDA regulations where products couldn't be moved as easily into the marketplace. And with that saturation and with that high capacity for extraction, a lot of folks found themselves with nothing to do and no ability to move their product. So that focus has led to infrastructure development, ag-based development, harvesters, decortication, which removes the fiber from the plant, of course. We're looking at the derivatives of the plant from a cellulose, heliulose, lignins, and sugar perspective, and the various sectors that those parts of the plant ultimately do service. We're looking at seed conditioning, seed cleaning equipment. Yes, there's extraction in these facilities, but farmers are moving because of USDA regulations towards a more whole plant use. No longer is the majority of what's being planted focused on feminized varieties just for cannabinoid production, at least in the United States. And I'll do a brief comparison of the US versus what's happening in the European Union here in just a moment. But let's continue down the road of COVID. We've also seen an impact on the food supply chain outside of industrial hemp, of course, because of interruptions in processing, because of lockdowns, because of transportation infrastructure lockdowns during the last several months. This has created a protein deficiency with a number of supply chain nations around the world that has exacerbated their existing protein deficiencies. Of course, hemp can fill that. So we've seen grain demand and grain pricing increase, although not remarkably. It's still not a scenario where comparing hemp grain to grain from other plant materials is apples and apples, because the price for hemp grain remains so high. And it just hasn't been integrated yet into the world food supply chain as a major component. Although we're seeing those doors begin to open and continue to open. In fact, a lot of the Canadian supply was ultimately replanted here in the United States because of border crossing and international commerce concerns, at least, that evolved and emerged during the early days of COVID. We've seen folks selling CBD make claims. CBD products make claims that somehow CBD can cure the coronavirus or address the symptoms. And we've seen crackdowns at a number of states. It certainly hasn't given the industry very, very much credibility in certain circles, but in other circles, it has the utmost credibility. We've seen the United States federal government issue a research panel under its National Institute of Health to study the use of cannabinoids for the treatment and/or impact of the coronavirus on human beings. And we've seen positive results come out of that. We've seen news stories from different research firms around the world indicating that the anti-inflammatory properties combined with other properties within the industrial hemp plant found in cannabinoids and terpenes actually help mitigate symptoms of the coronavirus. But it still doesn't mean that folks can go out and make those representations and those claims when they're selling products in the marketplace. And that speaks to perhaps the level of sophistication of the industry operators, although it's gotten remarkably better over the last several years as it moves towards a mainstream product, or at least mainstream ingredient at brick and mortar stores all around the world. We've also seen the evolution of smokable hemp products and even THC products that come from hemp on the really, really aggressive side of the industry. And those had been exposed in part by the COVID scenario and the slowdown, which has brought attention to businesses that otherwise might slip under the radar. And finally, as it relates to industrial hemp and COVID, we've seen a major incorporation of hemp or cannabis generally as a plant species into economic development plans around the world. We saw the Costa Rica president about 2 months ago come out and said that cáñamo, industrial hemp, would be a centerpiece of that country's recovery from the economic downturn suffered several weeks ago from COVID, which has likely only been exacerbated now, particularly due to the surge in COVID cases across Latin America. We've seen the same notion about cannabis come from the Colombian government, the Brazilian government, the Mexican government, and their nationalized healthcare systems. So the opportunity that exists for what was previously an export-only market, Latin America, now looking at domestic distribution, in cooperation and in coordination with nationalized healthcare systems, creates an opportunistic scenario for folks in the space that have the capability to produce high-level consumer-friendly products on an international scale. So then we move forward and we look at what 2020 has yet to provide for this industry. As I mentioned, I do see much more of a focus from an investment perspective amongst our clients and our clients that are operators, where the investment's coming from, along the lines of infrastructure development. If this plant is going to follow the rules that the USDA set out, then it requires a shift in focus away from cannabinoids only, which is horticultural style, to a more ag-based style of how to produce plant material that comes from industrial hemp. And it protects farmers under the USDA rules to effectively require that plants be planted that service multiple industries, not just a unstable cannabinoid marketplace. So we've looked at the supply chain development. The 2018 Farm Bill, of course, removed any question about industrial hemp and its legality. It removed hemp and all of its derivatives, compounds, cannabinoids. That's not a quote, that's a paraphrase, but it's a very broad exception under federal law to remove the plant and all of those materials from the Controlled Substances Act. That's led to uncertainty, it's led to hesitation, but it's also led to the FDA stepping up and identifying what the pathway is. Now, we haven't seen final rules from the FDA yet. To date, under the 2018 Farm Bill, we've only seen the USDA, the Department of Ag rules, which allow state programs to be adopted and approved, and then create a pathway for farmers to produce legal material under both federal and state law. But what has yet to happen is the FDA has yet to come out and say that these are the rules. This is the pathway, this is the lane. Although it is very likely that the FDA, wink, wink, follows the Colorado model of the hemp foods policy. In other words, that hemp-based derivatives under a certain milligram content will be situated as food products, and if there are modifications made to the regulations or an exception, as supplements as well. And of course, you're going to have cannabinoids be introduced as active ingredients in a number of new drug applications over the next number of years as major pharmaceutical companies step into this space. As I alluded to earlier, there's sort of a divide about what's happening in the US versus what's happening in the European Union. And the European Union is probably the second largest market of consumers to provide cannabinoid-based products for human consumption to and into. And there were thousands and thousands of brick and mortar stores that sold these products until recently, when plaintiffs' consumer protection lawsuits, because of something called the novel foods issue in Europe, limited that distribution in brick and mortar substantially. But the focus is very much on the development of the CBD industry right now in Europe. Whereas in the United States, the CBD, the cannabinoid industry, has emerged and evolved to rare and seldom identified cannabinoids in terms of large commercial distribution. It's evolved past that to this full-blown plant approach, which the USDA encourages and perhaps even requires, which is interesting considering the European Union has had these products in the marketplace and regulations for so very long, prior to the US putting the 2014 Farm Bill in place. And now all of a sudden, they're back to where we were a couple of years ago. But we need to see consistent regulations come out of the European Union, the UK, no longer a member of the European Union, and the United States to set the world standard for both the use of isolates and broader full spectrum compounds in food products. We've seen that there are these 1% countries that allow up to 1% THC content in the plant material, at least presumably getting advantage in the cannabinoid market, but they become less advantageous when they look at a full plant use ag-based commodity marketplace. And that's kind of the shift we're seeing. Plus, I would venture a guess that once Customs and Border Patrol understands that 1% THC hemp outside of the United States, absent a federal change here in the United States, would be considered marijuana, and stops imports of hemp-derived materials outside of the United States. So having the 1% THC is actually not a benefit except for efficiency purposes, but for marketplace and regulatory purposes, it might even be a detriment. As we look at the FDA rules come out and we look at different countries around the world, we've seen our neighbors to the immediate south and the Mexican government move forward on a plan after they previously allowed North American US-based companies to register CBD products with their FDA equivalent called Cofepris. And that is something that we saw that stopped. And now we see new laws and new rules being enacted in Mexico, which will prompt regulations in the beginning of 2021. We've seen the Anvisa nationalized healthcare system in Brazil take a stand in favor of replacing prescription medications with low-cost plant-based medicines for purposes of budget and public health, and that's moved forward. And then we've looked at the stability of pricing. we have not seen stable pricing in the cannabinoid marketplace to the point where one day they're here, one day they're way down here. And that's in large part because of the oversupply, but also because some of the folks that you'll hear for the rest of the day, they'll talk about pricing indexes and pricing standards, a critical thing to pay attention to as an operator or as an investor in this marketplace, so that you understand, A, how to structure a contract in a volatile marketplace in terms of commodity or wholesale and retail pricing, but also how to modify that in the event of drastic market changes, so that we don't see deals that are set on firm numbers simply fall apart because of the inability to perform. But I do see a lot of promise with what I'd call the new hemp economy occurring and being driven in North America through innovation in the ag sector. Not to say that cannabinoids don't have a place, they have a major place. But as we look at fuels, and as we look at the building blocks for plastic, and as we look at graphene as a superconductor, and as we look at other uses of the plant material, we see oil and gas companies from Texas taking major research steps forward. We see plastic manufacturers of water bottles across the country, retailers that use plastic bags, looking at hemp-based packaging. We see Fortune 500 companies looking at hemp-based packaging. So those are all things that I see coming in 2020, which is very exciting. And with that said, I'd love to take a couple of questions here, Tracy, or if you could help point out where they might be on my screen.
I'd be more than happy to help you with that, Bob. So much information. Thank you. It's really great to see you again and learn so much incredible stuff about hemp. So we have two questions right now. Question number one, when do you foresee the banking industry finally accepting hemp businesses as legitimate? Does hemp need to be legal federally for the current climate to change?
So hemp is indeed.
Did you hear me okay, Bob?
I am. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you. Yes, sir.
All right. Hemp is indeed legal federally. And banking should not be a problem. I say should, but of course we've seen banks that have either failed to understand or failed to recognize what's clearly in black and white words in our federal laws. So that's required. As lawyers, we've been able to turn those banks around almost 100% of the time and say what you're dealing with is a legal substance. But then sometimes they make the distinction of, well, if you're growing a legal plant versus a plant material, a CBD product, for example, that's not yet regulated by the FDA, that means it's illegal. Well, that doesn't mean it's illegal. It just means it's not affirmatively regulated as CBD. But these legal nuances are sometimes lost. So banking is and should be available. There's no 280E tax issues that the marijuana or the cannabis side of the industry faces. And if there are banks that refuse to work with you, there is a number of others, but there's also ways to change their mind based on facts.
Yeah, the cannabis industry has been super tricky around getting banking. And now that in California, there's such a big spotlight on it, people are really struggling with trying to figure out how to bank their money. So we have a COVID-19 question. During COVID, I saw a lot of supply chains being disrupted in terms of packaging. Many brands receive their packaging from China. Do you see more brands switching to solely purchasing packaging supplies domestically now? And does that give startups like myself bringing hemp packaging forward an advantage? It's a great question.
It's a great question. I think that, yes, it gives you an advantage because of the decreased participation in that supply by those Asian countries, China in particular. But here's an interesting thing. We've seen Mexico step up to the plate in a major way and replace a lot of the packaging needs for a lot of this entire industry. Percentage-wise, I can't tell you, this is not scientific, but I do know that dozens and dozens of people that I've worked with, reviewed contracts for, that they've gone to Mexico to get Mexico to provide packaging for them, which has been an increase in the Mexican economy as well, but also a nice segue for Mexico as a soon-to-be major world participant in the global cannabis industry, which I can't even believe we're talking about, which is so exciting.
I know this whole situation with COVID has been really interesting. And I noticed earlier that you had brought up the point about, there being a light being shown on CBD and cannabis for COVID. And I just wanted to kind of jump in and have a quick little 2-minute conversation with you while we have a couple of minutes about left with us. We've been actually doing research with Dr. Anahit Jewett, and we have shown that by taking cannabinoids, and we're not sure if it's CBD or THC or a blend of all because we're studying the blood of these patients, that it's turning the natural killer cells back on, which is the leading part of our immune system. And there's now research coming out of Canada showing that cannabis consumption can boost the immune system and help fight COVID by 70 to 80%. I actually really truly believe that this is the case, and we think that we're going to have research pretty soon that helps to support that initiative, because what we're seeing come out of China is that the COVID-19 is killing and destroying the NK cells. So what happens when you have obesity or you have cancer or you have an immunological issue, you already have a broken natural killer cell system, you're already susceptible, and COVID is coming in and wiping the rest of that out. Well, cannabis, CBD products actually turn that system on and boost it up. So that's one of the exciting things that I hope we continue to see, which will help potentially get us, more regulatory around this incredible plant.
No, it's very well said. By the way, here's the way. This is a lawyer's way of describing science, which is never a good way to do it. But think of two pieces of Velcro, right? When you use a cannabis formulation, it takes that one piece of Velcro and turns it upside down. And then what happens? So the exterior Velcro is COVID. Your body is the other side. It doesn't allow, it creates a situation which mitigates the opportunity for the virus to interact with your body and actually attach to the human body and the human body systems. That's my lay description of what I understand it can do. But mixed with other things such as something called NAC and something called Mullen and something called vitamin D3 and melatonin and quercetin. There's lots of combinations that they're studying right now that seem to have an impact. But even if they do, and I believe that they do, to your point, Tracy, that doesn't mean people watching or listening can go out and put a product out in the marketplace and said, look, this is what that does. And unfortunately, that's not common knowledge all the time.
I know. Tell me about it. But we'll get there, Bob. I have all the confidence in the world that we'll get there. And thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. I would ask everyone to give you a round of applause, but we wouldn't be able to hear them. So I'll give you one myself. Great to see you. And thank you again for today.